Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. Chapter 2. Paul Holt stepped out of his office in the large Victorian frame house on the lakeshore and pulled the rope on the brass bell mounted on the porch railing. He brushed his thick blonde hair away from his eyes and leaned back against the railing as the counselor trainees gathered in front of him. At 25, he was senior to oldest of them by a mere 6 years, and he was painfully aware of his responsibility to take charge immediately and make sure they all did their jobs. If this counselor training session went well and the camp officials he had contracted with were pleased with the results, there was good chance he'd get referrals to other summer camps and be able to double his enrollment next year. It was an excellent way of adding a couple of weeks of extra work to the summer season and building up a part-time vacation business for himself. He got to spend an enjoyable few weeks in the woods running his own business and picking up some extra money for grad school. He looked around trying to remember all their names as they started to come out from the other cabins where they had been unpacking and settling in. There was Mark, a dark, muscular boy of about 18, confined to a wheelchair as a result of a tragic motorcycle accident. Yet, despite his handicap, he was remarkably self-sufficient. He'd been an excellent role model for the kids at camp, proving that you could accomplish whatever you set your mind to. Vickie, a pretty, leggy brunette of about 17, came up behind Mark as he struggled to get his wheelchair through the soft dirt and up a slight incline to the main house. She offered to help him with a push, but Mark resolutely shook his head, making the well-meaning girl look hurt, as if he had rejected her. Paul sighed. Perhaps Mark was a bit too self-sufficient. There were a few things he was going to have to learn, but they were the sort of things that no one would be able to teach him. He'd have to come to them by himself. Often, people who were handicapped became overly sensitive to other people trying to help them. In a sense, it was understandable because no one wanted to be pitied or condescended to, and all too often, otherwise well-meaning people could become very intrusive, such as grabbing a handicapped person's wheelchair and pushing it without bothering to ask if their help was wanted or needed. But there was differences between an intrusive person and someone offering to help out of a genuine desire to be supportive, even if you didn't want the help and felt it was important for you to make it on your own. There was no reason you couldn't smile and thank the person for the offer, refusing graciously. A simple shake of the head, such as Mark had given Vickie, was not meant as a rejection because Mark was not inconsiderate, and he probably felt self-conscious about the difficulty he was having. But Vickie had taken it as such. It was plain by the hurt expression on her face. Maybe we put too much emphasis on being self-sufficient and independent, Paul thought, watching them. Instead of stressing competitiveness, perhaps, we ought to stress accomplishment instead, not for the sake of winning, but just for the joy of it, with the focus on achieving things together. Maybe then we wouldn't have such a hard time communicating, and people might not get hurt so easily. Terry, a shapely girl of 18, was coming down the hiking trail with her dog Muffin, tagging along behind her. Paul had some doubts about her decision to bring that dog along. It wasn't exactly an outdoor dog, like Shepherd or a setter. It was one of those cute little lap dogs about the size of a football, and it was all hair and ribbons. Paul didn't understand. Who in the world would wrap a dog up like a Christmas present? The dog would pick up a million brambles in country like this, not to mention fleas and ticks, and Lord only knew what sort of parasites from the lakes and streams. And in the woods, a domestic dog wouldn't stand a chance against the sort of wildlife it could encounter. Paul had even seen German shepherds get done in by raccoons who were a lot more ferocious than they looked, and canny enough to lure the dogs into a river or a pond and then drown them by climbing on their heads and clinging there. Even on bare ground, a coon could give a hunting dog one hell of a bad time. A little hairball like Muffin wouldn't last 3 seconds. However, there wasn't much he could do about it now. She had brought the dog with her, and it seemed pointless to make an issue out of it now. Terry would find out for herself that there was a lot of difference between the wilderness and a city park. As she came down the hill, Scott stepped out from behind a stand of bushes and took aim at her denim-out cutoffs with a wooden slingshot. He let the elastic fly, and the pebble struck Terry in the ass. Crying out, she brought her hand back instinctively and spun around as Scott stepped out from behind the bushes. He tapped the slingshot slightly against his chin, giving her a smoldering look and a wink. Terry grimaced wryly and turned around, continuing back down toward the main house. Seeing them, Paul thought that some guys never outgrew that dipping the pigtails in ink stage. Ted came up, not watching where he was going, and banged into the porch steps because he was so engrossed in his pocket computer game. He rubbed his shin and looked up at Paul sheepishly, then sat down on the steps. It was a heck of a crew, thought Paul. It looked like he had his work cut out for him. And to top things off, Jenny hadn't even shown up yet. Things were getting off to a somewhat shaky start. Okay, let's settle down, he said, consulting with his clipboard and looking around at them. With the exception of Jenny, everyone seemed to be present. It's great to have y'all here at our new counselor training center, he said. You've all worked as counselors at one camp or another. Terry, Vickie, you two were upstate last summer, right? Scott, hi. Good to see you here, buddy. You'll need it. The others laughed as Scott shook his head wearily. And Mark, Paul continued, I know we've worked a season or two together, right? Mark smiled at the recognition. The rest of you, I'll get to know you soon enough, Paul went on, noting several new faces. I'm sure there's one thing I don't have to tell any of you. Being a counselor isn't the gravy summer job everyone thinks it is. And what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks, if the rest of my staff ever shows up, is go back to the basics. Survival, first aid, boating, archery, rifle range, all of it. He was about to go on when what sounded like the crack of a rifle shot startled everyone, and they all turned around to see a dilapidated red Volkswagen convertible come banging down the dirt road leading into the camp, backfiring like a glutton at a chili cook-off and kicking up a cloud of dust. What the hell? Said Paul. The VW Bug swerved into the camp and skidded to a stop beneath some trees. The driver was an attractive young woman in a white sleeveless blouse and pink skirt. Her blonde hair was pinned up. She looked relieved as she leaned back against the seat with a sigh, shutting up the noisy mutter. Jenny, Paul thought, of course. What else was he supposed to expect? It was hard enough trying to run a training session with a bunch of kids who probably just wanted to smoke dope and run off into the woods together without having your first assistant showing up late in a ratty old VW with the gas pains. Where had she picked up that wreck and why? I'll be right back, he said to Ted. He went over to the car. Hi, said Jenny cheerfully. I'm late. Paul gave her a hard stare. Come with me. She shrugged and followed him up to one of the other cabins. They went up the steps of the porch and he beckoned her inside, then closed the door behind them. Once out of sight of the others, he turned on her angrily. What's this crap, Jenny? You're supposed to be my assistant. Everyone else got here hours ago. I said I'm sorry, she interrupted. You did? She grimaced wryly, realizing she hadn't said any such thing. I'm sorry, okay? My car is sick. You could have called. Paul, I did try. Your phones aren't working yet. Paul took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She did have a point there. The telephones should have been taken care of by now, but of course they were still off. He should have pursued that, but with so much going on, he had spaced it. All right, he said, easing up. Get your gear stowed and help me outside, okay? Paul, look, Jenny said. The course starts today. Here I am, and I promise you, I'll never be late again in my entire life. Paul raised his eyebrows skeptically. Well, she said, do we have a deal? He chuckled. All right. What the hell? He put his arms around her and pulled her close. I was starting to worry about you. She smiled and kissed him on the nose. Bullshit, Paul. They went back outside, and Paul was a bit disconcerted to see the grins on all of their faces. He tried to look more serious as he pretended to consult his clipboard, hoping that his embarrassment wouldn't show. Put your car on the lot, okay? He said to Jenny without looking up. This place is starting to look like Burger King. He looked back up at the counselors. All right, where was I? You were about to give us your "let's keep our shit together" speech, said Ted, grinning. Paul gave him a look, and he quickly added, Mr. Holt? Right, said Paul. Okay. He looked around at the group. They were all doing their best to look very serious. He shook his head. A few words about safety, okay? Jenny got behind the wheel of the old VW Bug and turned the key in the ignition. The starter made a terrible grinding noise. Now, I want running kept down to a minimum, said Paul, continuing his speech. Respect the equipment. It's going to be very, very expensive equipment that we'll be handling. Jenny kept trying the ignition, but the starter just kept grinding, draining the battery. The counselors were paying more attention to her efforts than they were to Paul. Axes, knives, saws, Paul continued, undaunted. They can all be trouble. Their misuse is the main cause of camp accidents. Jenny kept trying to start the car, relentlessly, and for a moment it seemed that her stubbornness was going to pay off. The motor caught for a second, then backfired violently, coughed, and died. Take care of your equipment, Paul went on, ignoring her, and it'll take care of you. Jenny slumped back in the car seat with a sigh, looking defeated. She glanced back toward the counselors and saw that most of them were watching her rather than listening to Paul. She grinned and shrugged. Now, a word of caution about our friends in the forest, Paul said. Scott and Mark exchanged glances. Scott mouthed, "Friends in the forest," and rolled his eyes. Mark stifled a laugh. Among other things, Paul went on, oblivious to their actions. This is bear country, and, contrary to what everybody hears, bears are dangerous. I don't want to see any sloppy use of food around the camp. A black bear can smell a cookie a mile away. Jeff and Sandra giggled. This means no food fights, Paul said seriously. And those nights we camp out, no eating in your tents. Change often. If you're a woman, don't use perfume, and keep clean during your menstrual cycle. Vickie and Terry exchanged glances, hardly able to believe he had actually said that. Meanwhile, Jenny had gone back to trying to start her car again with no more success than the last time. Paul finally relented and went over to see what he could do to help. Having trouble? He said. She looked up at him and nodded, sighing heavily. You gotta treat 'em gentle, he said with mock seriousness. Just like kids. Use a little of that child psychology you're majoring in. Jenny made a face at him as he walked around behind the car and opened the motor compartment. He loosened the wing nut, holding the air filter on. He took out the air filter, and it was filthy and clogged beyond belief. He shook out as much dirt as possible and then checked her distributor cap. He tightened it. With the air filter still off, he placed his hand over the carburetor intake. Try it, he said. Jenny turned the key and the motor kicked over, coughing once and sending a spray of soot all over Paul. Coughing, he squinted and waved his hand in front of his face and replaced the air filter and the cover. Jenny backed up until she was even with him, and with a grin said, It's more fun using child psychology on you. She winked. You're such a sucker for it. Paul watched her with irritation as she swung the car around and rattled off toward the parking lot. He shook his head. She always did it to him, every single time. No matter what it was, she simply grinned and shrugged it off as if life were nothing but a joke. He glanced off toward the counselors, who weren't even trying to hide their smiles anymore. Well, at least they thought it was funny. He, however, was not laughing. She was always accusing him of being too serious. Well, perhaps he was at times, but here, at camp, there was a reason for everything, including his seriousness. For the most part, these kids were from the city and the suburbs. They weren't like country kids who grew up around the woods and had a healthy respect for the wilderness. Just as you didn't walk alone on Canal Street in New York City at 1 o'clock in the morning, there were certain precautions you took in the woods. How could these trainees ever hope to teach small children such things if they didn't take them seriously themselves? He looked back at them and sighed. Well, it was early yet. They were only getting started. There was still plenty of time for them to get it all together, assuming they applied themselves. Otherwise, they were liable to learn that the woods could be just as dangerous a place as any unlit alley at night. The trainees spent the rest of the day getting better acquainted with one another while they set everything up for the next 2 weeks. In spite of her seemingly carefree attitude, Jenny impressed Paul by quickly taking charge of getting the kitchen facilities in order, allowing him to make sure that all the equipment was properly stowed away, and enough firewood chopped to last them several days. They all pitched in and worked quickly and efficiently so that by the time dinner rolled around, they were all well ahead of schedule and had worked up an appetite. After dinner, they broke out the marshmallows and built a large campfire. As they relaxed near the flames and enjoyed the cool evening breeze of the lake, inevitable someone brought up the legend of Camp Blood. Sandra remembered where she had heard that name before, and she told everyone about how Crazy Ralph had accosted them with his grim warning as they drove into town. Vickie mentioned having heard some rumors in town that the boy who had drowned, Jason Voorhees, had never actually drowned at all, but that he had survived and was living like some sort of crazy hermit in the woods. Paul allowed them to speculate a while on all the stories they had heard, and then, picking his moment carefully, he said, "I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason." Immediately, all eyes were on him. He stared into the fire for a long moment, prolonging the suspense, making sure he had their undivided attention. Then he continued. "His body was never recovered from the lake after he drowned," he said quietly, making eye contact with each of them in turn. "And if you listen to the old-timers in town, they'll tell you he's still out there. Some sort of demented creature." He lowered his voice slightly and got a faraway look in his eyes. "Surviving in the wilderness. Full grown by now. Stalking." He stretched the pauses out for maximum effect, noticing how they snuggled closer together, how they moved nearer to the fire, how their eyes occasionally glanced off uneasily into the darkness. Stealing what he needs. Living off wild animals and vegetation. He looked around at them and said softly, "Some folks claim they've even seen him. Right here in this area." Sandra huddled closer to Jeff and glanced at him uneasily. He tried to look as if he wasn't buying any of it, but he didn't quite succeed. His smile seemed a little strained. It was only a ghost story, he told himself, but there was something really spooky about a ghost story that had really happened, especially when you were hearing it so close to the place where it had happened. He thought back to the sign Sandra had found laying in the bushes, the warped and peeling sign bearing the legend, Camp Crystal Lake. And he thought about the way Ted's voice had sounded when he had seen it and said, Camp Blood, and about how Ted had wanted to get away from there as quick as possible. Paul continued with his story. "The girl who survived that night at Camp Blood," he paused. "That's Friday the 13th. She claims she saw him." Vickie swallowed nervously as she became completely caught up in the story. Terry hunched her shoulders and moved a little closer to Scott. Even Jenny was starting to feel caught up in the tale. There was something about the story, the place, Paul's tone, and the crackling of the flames mixed with the night sounds that reached down deep and touched some primitive chord within them all. Fear of the night, of the unknown, of unseen predators. "You know, she disappeared 2 months later," Paul said, his voice very quiet now, his eyes staring into the fire. "Vanished. Blood was everywhere. No one quite knows what happened to her." Jenny licked her lips nervously as she realized that the part of it was definitely true. Paul wasn't just making it up. She remembered reading about it in the papers. The girl's name had been Alice, and she had returned to the town of Crystal Lake to exorcise her demons. The papers had made much of that fact, and Jenny, being a psych major, had become interested in the story. The girl had survived a series of grisly murders committed by Pamela Voorhees, a local woman who had been driven insane with grief over the drowning of her son Jason. Apparently, the Voorhees woman held the counselors responsible for her boy's death, and in a classic case of transference, she confused the counselors working at the camp the following summer with those who had worked there when her son had drowned. In her twisted mind, they were all the same and they were all to blame, so they had to die. Apparently, she caught 2 of the young camp counselors alone making love in the barn, and she slaughtered them. The bodies were hacked to pieces, almost beyond recognition. The authorities moved quickly and closed the camp down, but the case was never solved. Back then, no one ever connected the Voorhees woman with the murders. But strange events continued at the camp for several years after that. The people who owned it tried to open it up the following year, but first the water was poisoned, and then there were some fires. They gave up finally, and the camp was closed down permanently and abandoned to fall into disrepair. And then, some years later, a young man named Steve Christie tried to open up the camp again, undaunted by the rumors of a curse. He refurbished it and repaired all the damage, bought lots of new equipment, and hired new counselors to arrive a couple of weeks early and help get the place operational. It was a fatal error. In her insane fury, the Voorhees woman had murdered all the counselors at the camp, including the camp's owner, Steve Christie. And in a desperate life-or-death struggle with the mad woman, Alice struck at her with a machete and decapitated her. According to the papers, she had then experienced a lapse of consciousness, a blackout of some sort, no doubt induced by shock, and she came to in the hospital, claiming that the boy Jason had come up out of the lake and tried to pull her in. Of course, the papers capitalized on that remark and blew it out of proportion. Jenny remembered reading about it and thinking, God, that poor girl. No wonder she was having hallucinations after a traumatic experience like that. It must have been PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The same thing Vietnam veterans experienced after returning home from the war. Alice had kept reliving the events that had caused the trauma, and she had finally decided to return to the place where it all happened, evidently hoping to convince herself it was over. And she had nothing left to fear. It turned out she had been wrong. Dead wrong. Legend has it, Jason saw his mother beheaded that very night. Paul continued in an ominous tone. That he took his revenge. Mark looked over his shoulder nervously. Paul was whispering now, and sounds of the crackling flames and the crickets and the night birds seemed very loud. The wind blowing through the trees sounded like the rustle of someone approaching, someone or something. A revenge that he'll continue to seek if anyone ever enters his wilderness again, said Paul, looking at each of them. And by now, I guess you all know that we're the first to return here. They all held their breath, watching him, frozen with fascination. 5 years, Paul said, looking around at all of them, maintaining eye contact, drawing them deeper into the spirit of the story. 5 years now he's been dormant. And he's hungry. His voice was barely a whisper now, and they were all leaning forward, hanging on to his every word. Jason is out there, Paul said, as if he himself was frightened of what he was telling them. Watching. Always on the prowl for intruders. Waiting to kill. Waiting to devour. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Thirsty for young blood, Paul said. And suddenly a half-naked figure leapt into the circle, out of the darkness, beyond the fire, screaming hideously and brandishing a spear. The face was grotesque, a travesty of human features, deformed and twisted. Everyone screamed and scrambled away from the frightening apparition, all except Paul, who stood there grinning. "Come back! Come back!" he called, laughing. He approached the creature and ripped away the grotesque mask, revealing Ted. No one had noticed him slip away, as Paul had occupied their attention with the story, and now they all saw how they'd been had. They drifted back with groans and muttered curses, feeling foolish, yet at the same time greatly relieved. Ted stood there, chuckling, reenacting his role by brandishing the spear and making hideous faces. "Okay," said Paul, "now that we got that out of our system, I don't want to hear any more about it. It's ancient history. Jason drowned, Mrs. Voorhees was killed, and Camp Crystal Lake is off limits. Got it?" Everyone muttered assent, and a few of them started laughing in appreciation of the joke. They gathered around Ted, punching him playfully as he fake lunged at them with his spear. Paul spotted Jenny coming back. She was still looking around her a little nervously, so Paul grinned and gave her a hug. "Gotcha, huh?" he said, winking at her. "So, what did you think?" "The second act needs work," Jenny said wryly. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 2 of Friday the 13th, Part 2 by Simon Hawke. Hope you enjoyed this chapter. We're still at the beginning of the story here. I haven't put out a chapter of this in well over a week. The plan was a special celebrity was going to come in and voice Paul for this book. The person who was going to voice him is from a very recent, very popular Jason project that everyone is very familiar with. But in talking about just voicing that one role, the talk evolved into him bringing in a whole celebrity cast to voice characters for Friday the 13th Part 3, the novelization by Simon Hawke, when I narrate it next month. So we went from something small to something much bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and finish out Friday the 13th Part 2 with no special guest voice. But that celebrity is going to be bringing in some other people from his project. I can't say what it is yet, the one that he worked on, but you all know it and most of you love it. And so when I do Part 3 by Simon Hawke, it's going to be a blast. But I'll be back very soon, and I promise very soon this time, with more of Friday the 13th Part 2 by Simon Hawke. I really enjoyed the character development tonight. I always loved the beginning of the movie, where Paul's telling the story of Pamela and Jason and Alice. But yeah, until next time, this is your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, see you soon, and don't click that thumbs down button, because... It's got a death!